Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Updating NDAA's National Juvenile Prosecution Standards and Juvenile Prosecution Policy Positions and Guidelines. My name is Carissa Rano, and I'm with OJJDP's National Training and Technical Assistance Center. As your technical host, I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few of the features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform and provide a few announcements to keep in mind. For those of you wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handouts pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where the presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arrive. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a moment and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into a chat pod at this time. Following today's webinar, attendees will be sent a certificate of attendance. The certificate is sent approximately 1 hour following the conclusion of the event and is sent via an Adobe Connect thank you email. Please keep an eye out on your email for your certificate. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks on OJJDP's online university at www.ojjdpou.org, where you can also view past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I'll now turn it over to Susan Broderick.
Thanks so much, Carissa. Good afternoon, everyone. And it is actually such an honor to be part of this webinar today. And we were just talking before we started, and we're pretty amazed at the amount of people that have signed up for it. And it's really exciting to see so many people interested in the role of the juvenile prosecutor and working with juvenile prosecutors. So just wanted to start by giving a little bit of my background. I'm currently the project director of the National Juvenile Justice Prosecution Center. I have spent my entire career working either as a prosecutor or working with prosecutors. I started my career in the Manhattan DA's office in 1989, and I worked on everything from homicides to child abuse cases, and I've been working in the juvenile justice field since 2006. I spent several years working with the MacArthur Foundation on their Models for Change program, and for the last, since 2008, I've been at Georgetown and currently working on this project from OJJDP. And my co-presenter today, or our presenter, is Anthony Piero, and I'll let Anthony introduce himself now.
All right, thank you, Susan. I appreciate it. I am the Chief Juvenile Attorney at the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey. I have been with the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office now for 18 years. I started in the 90s, and I have served all over the office. When I actually requested to come back to juvenile, of course, that drew a number of chuckles and interest in why somebody who was advancing through the prosecutor's office would want to go back. I have been here since 2000 and became the chief in 2003. So this has been really my focus and my passion. When I asked again to return to the unit, it was because of all the work that we're doing, all the things that we're talking about. I'm really so, again, honored to be here as well. And hopefully there's a lot in this presentation that we can deliver.
Great. And that's one of the things. So now, oops.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So just to start out, to give everybody an overview of the project that we're working on, back in 2014, we had applied for a solicitation that went out, and it was part of OJJDP's Smart on Juvenile Justice, a comprehensive strategy that they had developed to improve the juvenile justice system. And we submitted a proposal through a competitive process, and we were selected to serve as the national TA provider for prosecutors all over the country. And you'll see on this slide the other groups that have been selected, and we're all working together with regard to various issues and stakeholders throughout the juvenile justice system. And we are working with a number of partners on this project. And one of those is the National District Attorneys Association and the Juvenile Prosecutor Leadership Network, and Equitas, which is the National Resource Center for Violence Against Women, And through collaborating, we were able to work on a number of the deliverables that were included in our grant. The Juvenile Prosecutor Leadership Network is actually a group of senior level prosecutors that started back under the MacArthur Foundation grant. And basically it's a group of 14 senior levels. 2 of the members are actually elected DAs, and the other are very senior division chiefs and things like that. Anthony is one of our members, and we meet twice a year at Georgetown, and the group is comprised of prosecutors from all different types of jurisdictions. So we have rural jurisdictions, we have the big cities, New York City, Philadelphia, San Diego, as well as Sheridan, Wyoming, and all across the country. So we're working to make sure that every type of jurisdiction is represented in the work that we're doing, and we very often have experts come in and talk to us. We've had experts come in on adolescent brain development, screening and assessment, working on drug and alcohol issues, you know, everything that, all the different issues that juvenile court prosecutors and juvenile justice stakeholders face. So right now, one of the reasons that the OJJDP recognized that there needed to be a national clearinghouse and a national TA provider for juvenile court prosecutors is because we truly are at a unique moment in time in terms of what's going on with regard to juvenile justice. We're at a historic low in terms of the decline in referrals to court. We're down about 1 million referrals over the last several years. We've seen a real increase in diversion and alternatives to both referrals and incarceration and processing. There's been a lot more attention with regard to research, and that's in terms of, you know, adolescent brain research, trauma-informed care, and other really important issues that we're facing. And another unfortunate moment in the field has been the opioid epidemic, and that's something that we're grappling with. And as you're going to hear from Anthony, he's doing a lot of work out on the front lines. And one of the things we see is the evolving role of the prosecutors, because we have less cases coming in, we're able to be out there on the front lines doing a lot more within our communities with regard to prevention and early intervention programs. So now, oh, and this is another thing, the Prosecutors Training Institute it's based up in New York, and they are a source of training and technical assistance for prosecutors all over. They've created a national resource called the Prosecutors Encyclopedia. The link is contained on this slide. I do have to warn it, because I know that we have a lot of different stakeholders on today's webinar. This is a resource that is only available to prosecutors. And when you go to log in, they're going to have to verify that you actually work in a prosecutor's office. So, but this is a really wonderful, wonderful web-based resource guide. And when we first were awarded this grant, I had reached out to the folks that run the Prosecutors Encyclopedia, and there was nothing on there regarding juvenile justice. So one of the deliverables from this grant has been creating information page on the Prosecutors Encyclopedia, and you can go on there and you'll see we have research papers, studies, data, reports, and you know, we're updating it on a daily basis, sometimes weekly basis, but it's really a wonderful, wonderful resource for juvenile court prosecutors. And so the other thing that we're doing as part of this award is we've also developed a training curriculum, and it's covering a number of different issues, including the role of the juvenile court prosecutors, childhood and adolescent development, diversion, sexual assault cases, and again, all the different issues that juvenile court prosecutors are facing on a daily basis and are not really getting trained on. And
so,
now I'm going.
Yeah, go ahead, Susan. I'm sorry. So, you know, I want to get back to the unique time in the field, as Susan was was saying, you know, like I said, I've been a juvenile prosecutor since 1999, and I tell this story everywhere that I go. The first case that I ever was handed was the 9-year-old boy who had chased a 10-year-old girl up a tree to give her a kiss. And in 1999, that was actually a case that was presented to me as something that should be handled in a juvenile court. And we were handling in Ocean County, New Jersey, probably about 5,000 juvenile complaints a year, which was an incredibly high number. We had 2 assistant prosecutors. We were in court 5 days a week, all the time, basically. We had 3 different court calendars. We had a 9 o'clock court calendar, a 10:30 court calendar, and a 1:30 court calendar. And each of those would have 50 to so cases on at a time. And we were simply doing that. We were basically doing that with about 5% of the resources that this office had to handle what was about 50% of the cases. So we didn't have time to do anything. We really were not thinking about diversions and standards and are we doing this right. We were in a courtroom just trying to get by, just trying to handle those cases. And with the numbers dropping and with the focus on juvenile justice, when Susan says it's a unique time, I say that all over the country because people are interested. We have participants. We have people who actually think that juvenile justice is a priority. For the NDAA to pass standards is an incredible thing for us to have, so that there's guidance, so that there's, you know, as a juvenile prosecutor with your boots on the ground, that people care about the work that you do. And it's empowering, and it's just amazing where we are right now. So I'm going to show a video in a moment, but it shows some of the things that we can do. And I'm going to talk about community involvement and some of the things that we do as juvenile prosecutors in Ocean County. This video highlights it. This was a forum that we created to combat our opiate epidemic in Ocean County. We had so many kids who unfortunately were overdosing, using. We saw them come into court. We saw them when we responded. And we put on a program, and this video will highlight that.
Obliterate our spirit, poison our mind, drifted from the shore, living dark days on the run. There's a beacon of hope that will light you home. There's a light, there's a light. Fog in the dark, we can brave a heavy load. There's a light, there's a light. There's a light, there's a light. Just you guys.
We're not going to arrest our way out of this problem, but if we take everything and put it together and package it, maybe we can make a difference. And tonight what it is this is about saving a life. It's not about arresting anybody, it's about saving a life.
3 people last week in Toms River alone OD'd in a 12-hour period. Last week, Toms River, not Detroit, not Peoria, Illinois, your backyard, your streets.
Like a lighthouse, like a lighthouse, far in the dark and the other heavy load. Like a lighthouse, like a lighthouse, waiting in the dark.
We never believed it would be our son, not because we were perfect parents. We are imperfect parents. We struggled, and we knew that we had to teach our boys that no matter what, drugs are not the answer.
Chad went through the motions of getting clean, but in fact continued to use, and eventually was arrested and charged with possession.
When you reach the point in your life of whether you are going to make a good decision regarding drugs and alcohol or a bad decision, please think long and hard about what you are hearing tonight.
So that event ended up bringing about 4,000 people from our community to see. It was all paid for through forfeiture funds. We never use taxpayer money to do those types of events. And that is just an example of a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today about what prosecutors can do and how it is that prosecutors can be perceived in their community. And quite honestly, some of the things that we should be doing that because of this unique time, because of the interest, because of the concerns we have for the youth in our communities, that we do these things and become more than just that person who stands in a courtroom. However, I do have another video, and of course this is because my attention span is that of a small rodent. So I'm going to show you another video quickly. And of course, I'm from New Jersey. It has to be Rocky. So what does that have to do with anything we're talking about? But we still need prosecutors. You know, and I know what is so important for me as a prosecutor is to always talk about our role in these proceedings. That, listen, bad things are going to happen in our community. We need our prosecutors to be there. We need our prosecutors to be doing the right things, to be prosecuting the right cases. And I think that is what is so important about the standards. That's what's so important about the education that we as prosecutors get, the awareness that is really our responsibility to be aware of the studies, to be aware of the assessment tools, to be aware of what's going on around the country so that we can do a better job. Because that role will always be there. You know, our courtrooms aren't going away. That role will be there because bad things happen, because there are things that happen outside the scope of some of the things we're talking about today. But if we're not paying attention to adolescent brain development, if we're not paying attention to trauma-informed care, if we're not paying attention to substance abuse and how it works its way into our communities through our youth, then as prosecutors we're simply not doing our jobs. And it's really important that we do all of those things. So I think I'm going to turn it back over to Susan, who's going to talk a little bit about the standards.
Yes, thanks, Anthony. And that's one of the things, as I explained when I introduced myself, I spent many years, I spent 14 years actually, in the Manhattan DA's office, and I was not in juvenile court. I handled cases in the adult system, and my last 3 years there I spent working on child abuse cases. So when I started working in the juvenile unit, I saw that there's often a trajectory from child welfare to juvenile justice to the adult system. And one of the things, one of the reasons I love working in the juvenile field is that I truly believe that the juvenile court is a court of opportunity, and it is a position for prosecutors where you truly can turn a life around. And that's why I think it's really important that we're focusing attention on training, on technical assistance, because juvenile prosecutors are one of the most important positions in a district attorney or prosecutor's office. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the projects that we're tasked with under this grant was to update the National DA's prosecution standards. So we are lucky today to have Nelson Bunn from the National District Attorneys Association here to give us a little bit of background with regard to the National DA's prosecution standards. So Nelson?
Thanks, Susan. So as Susan said, I'm with the National District Attorneys Association, and I'm our Director of Policy here. So both engaging with the federal level officials in terms of policies and with criminal justice stakeholders in the field just to help and with operations. So I wanted just to talk for a brief minute about why standards and policy positions are so important to have. If we have clearly defined values and principles, there are a number of things that sort of lends itself to. The first one being that it gives us a guide for decision-making by prosecutors and other system participants. If there's something you can point to and say, hey, this is sort of a given best practice in the field, this is something that is a goalpost for where we need to get to, that really helps. Along with that is consistency. If you see that a number of jurisdictions are doing certain programming, certain approaches to issues they're facing, then maybe you can adopt that as well, and then that promotes consistency and then overall fairness in the system. The third one is that having standards allows for things to be measured. You have achievable outcomes based on standards. The fourth thing is it helps inform communities about system successes. It's important to not only understand what might not be working in your community, but to really highlight the successes and show progress and how different jurisdictions might be approaching topics that can be replicated to also have success in your own community. And then finally, it's important to help prosecutors explain how they exercise their discretionary powers. Prosecutors have quite a bit of discretion, and that's very important for a variety of reasons, but having standards that are measurable and that you can point to with justifiable information to back it up really allows you to tell a story of how you use your discretion and why that's important in the system. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Susan so she can talk about why we actually updated the standards that NDAA has worked on in the past.
Thanks, Nelson. So there's a number of reasons that we all recognize the need to make sure that the standards and the policy positions reflect advances in the field, both in terms of legal developments, in terms of the research. And another thing I wanted to mention, and this is actually unique to the juvenile court, is that every state has a different juvenile code. And so one of the things we realized with the standards and with the policy positions is that they have to be general enough so that we can adhere to the fact that every state probably has a juvenile code provision relating to this area. And so what some of our prosecutors have done are use these standards and policy positions as a framework to work within their juvenile code. For example, we have one of our senior members was George Mosey from Philadelphia, and so what he really did was make up some standards for the juvenile prosecutors in Pennsylvania. So that's just something I wanted to put out there, that you can be using these standards, these updated policy standards and policy positions, and using them within your jurisdictions and making sure that they align with your specific juvenile code. But in terms of why we did update these, again, there's been a lot of advances in the field. I don't think you can go to a conference these days without hearing about adolescent brain development, trauma-informed care, the opioid problem. And one of the issues is the fact that a lot of the information and a lot of the policy decisions are based on things that we never learned in law school. There's a reason I didn't get my degree in research. I'm a prosecutor, but we need to make sure that we are bringing this information to the prosecutors in a way that will not only inform them, but help them to employ the best practices and innovative solutions to the cases that they're dealing with. So, and you'll see in the standards, and again, since we only have an hour today, we're not going to be able to go through every standard and every policy position, but we have included, or the updates include, references to these changes. We talk about adolescent brain development, and one of the things that we discovered when we were looking at the research, again, we met with the experts in the field. Specifically, Jeff Butts from New York City, he's at John Jay, and he's been doing this work for many years. He's one of the leading experts, and he talked to us about how important it was with regard to the adolescent brain research to understand what the research says and maybe more importantly what the research doesn't say, and talking about how important adolescent brain research is in terms of recognizing just how open the brain is with regard to plasticity, with regard to rehabilitation, and with regard to turning lives around. So we wanted to make sure that all of this was reflected in the standards and the policy positions. And let's go to the next. you're going to see, in case you haven't looked at the handouts yet, that the unique role of the juvenile court prosecutors is reflected throughout the standards and policy positions. And it's really important in terms of recognizing the importance of it, because what happens very often in a lot of offices is that people right out of law school are just put into juvenile court as a training ground. And I can think of no other decision maker in the prosecutor's office that has more information to include in their decisions than a juvenile court prosecutor. You wear, as a juvenile court prosecutor, you wear so many different hats. You need to be concerned about a lot of different issues that adult court prosecutors don't even really get into. So you'll see reflected throughout these standards just what a unique and important role the juvenile court prosecutor has.
So we're gonna show that in a video. If we're gonna play that first, and then I'll comment on it. So how many of us in juvenile court get asked that all the time? What exactly do you do? I've spoken all over the place, and people still will come up to me and ask, what happens in juvenile court? And I think, when Nelson spoke and Susan spoke about it, that's also what the NDAA standards do for those of us that work here every day on the ground, is they remind us that what we do is incredibly important. And, that might not be important for someone like me. I've been doing it for 18 years. But when you're trying to groom those people to want a career as a juvenile justice prosecutor, which is what, quite honestly, I advocate and I think we should be advocating, is people who want to do this doing it, people who want to be involved. By way of example, I take it personally when a youth continues to commit crime into their adulthood, because that means we have done something. We have done something, and where could we have done it better? And if we're not allowing our young prosecutors to embrace juvenile court as a specialty, as a someplace that is worthy of their time, then I think we're not doing any justice to the system, because it can't just be people like myself and Susan and you all on the call. This has to be our young assistant prosecutors coming through who say, you know what, that's what I want to do. And we shouldn't be questioned on, so what do you do? Now, a lot of that has to do with the privacy of juvenile court. We don't get a lot of attention for the work that we do. It often goes unnoticed. But I have to say, that's where we have to do a better job of making sure that our young prosecutors understand the value of this work and the importance of this work. I have one more video I want to show you, because I think it also says something else about what we need to do as juvenile prosecutors. The webinar, how many of you believe that your juvenile prosecutor is there to help? How many of you actually believe that the people that appear on behalf of your state are there to help? And I make light of it with the video, but it's important for us to be seen as not just that person that only sends people to jail, that only asks for incarceration, that only looks for punitive type things. Certainly that's part of the role, but we need to make sure that we are seen as the movers and the changers that we actually can be. I have to tell you, I can think of no position more powerful than a juvenile prosecutor as it pertains to the culture in your community and the results therein. You want to create a diversion program, it's almost impossible without prosecutor support. You want to create a different culture and a different atmosphere, then you're going to need your juvenile prosecutor. And when you have that relationship and you actually believe that they are there to help, then I think it's incredibly important, and you're already one step ahead, because oftentimes it's going to take your juvenile prosecutor in some way, shape, or form to be the impetus for change, to be that person in the community that knows about assessments, that understands what it is that we mean. And it's incredible to me, because I think we're doing a great job at that, and I see the comments from people that in their jurisdictions they are seeing it, and that's phenomenal. That means that word is getting out, and that's part of what we're trying to do. So, Susan, did you want to discuss this slide, or I'll get right into it in terms of the prosecutorial responsibility? The primary duty is, of course, is to seek justice, right? And that's incredibly important. We would not be doing our communities any good if we weren't doing that. But when we seek justice, I want to read to you what George Mosey said about that and what actually a prosecutor does. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Luzerne County, Pennsylvania case. It was a very, very newsworthy case. It was also called the Kids for Cash scandal that happened out of Luzerne. And George, who's a very prominent prosecutor in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia, was part of that and really made so many significant changes as a result of that. And his quote is, a prosecutor has a special ethical obligation to be a minister of justice, and this solemn responsibility is enhanced in the context of juvenile delinquency proceedings under the principles of balanced and restorative justice. While prosecutors must assure the safety of the community and protect the rights of victims, prosecutors must go further in juvenile cases. A prosecutor must also weigh the needs of the juvenile offender, not with an eye toward punishment, but toward rehabilitation through the least restrictive means necessary. You know, and one of the things about that is how difficult that is, about how important that is, and about how we need to be committed to that as a system, and certainly as juvenile prosecutors. We need to make sure that without compromising the safety and the welfare of our community, that we are doing something for the youth that appear in court. And what's so important about that is, you know, I hear oftentimes, well, is that soft? Is that being soft? Is that really being a prosecutor? And the reality of it is, this is not, this is something where if you actually rehabilitate and you actually do it, you are saving your community, you are helping your community, you are making your community a safer place. And that, of course, has to be taken into account and taken into context.
Absolutely. Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah, of course. And that gets into, oh, I'm sorry, I advanced one more, Susan. I'll talk about the qualification real fast because this goes exactly toward what I was saying before and what Susan has said, and I know what Nelson has said, which is we have to have specialized training. We have to have people in these juvenile courtrooms that are aware of all the things that we've already talked about. This should be based upon the skill and the competence of the juvenile prosecutor. I was asked probably about 5 months ago, so when are you moving over to adult? And I thought, wow, really? Like, you really think I'm just stuck here for this long? Maybe I give off that impression, but we want people here who are well-trained. We want people here who are knowledgeable about our systems, that are knowledgeable about their child protective services systems, because of course I see some of the comments about crossover youth, about what that even means. You know, you could ask an inexperienced prosecutor, what's a crossover youth, and they might not know. And that's not the person you want, obviously, in the courtroom. So we have to do a job of training, and I think that's what the NDAA standards do as well, is that they, as Nelson said, they put out the framework that allows you to then take that into that courtroom.
Thanks, Anthony. And one of the things I'll also say is when we were looking over the standards and the guidelines, one of the things that we noted or we recommended is that we want to have juvenile prosecutors who want to work with kids. And we recognize in the NDAA policy positions and the standards the need for experienced prosecutors. But we're also recommending that we want those who really have a desire to work in juvenile court. Having an experienced prosecutor who has no desire to be in juvenile court, who's burnt out, disengaged, or just really doesn't care can really do more harm than good in juvenile court. So having that mixture of people with experience, but then also people who really have an excitement and are energetic and dedicated and convinced of the importance of early intervention are really those who are best suited for juvenile court. And this is something that, whether I'm talking to groups of juvenile court prosecutors or talking to the elected DAs are the ones who are going to be making the staffing decisions within their offices. They also need to know about just how important this position is and to recognize that they need to put really great assistance in these positions. So now with regard to the balanced approach, I think a lot of you have heard about it. This has been an approach that's been around, excuse me, since the 1990s. And what it really says, and it was sort of echoed in the George Mosey quote that Anthony gave you, is that prosecutors, we have a lot of considerations when we're looking at cases, and there isn't a balanced approach. And in terms of community safety, we always have to look at that. and regarding accountability to victims. That's so important. But then there's also competency development, and now sometimes that gets confused with competency issues and things like that. But in terms of competency development, I think it's all boiled down to the fact that we want to make sure that when we're working with a youth, that we can identify the strengths that they have, identify whatever weaknesses there are that in terms that we can help them, whether it be with regard to alcohol and drug use, whether it's regard to vocational training, and really kind of reminding yourself all the time, I want to make sure that this youth or this kid is coming out of juvenile court, they're leaving the system better off than when they came in. And that is one of the goals of being a juvenile court prosecutor. And Anthony, I think you're next with some of the pretrial considerations.
Yeah, so these are things that I'm going to talk specifically about all of these standards. And the first one, of course, is screening juvenile cases. In our jurisdiction, I screen every single juvenile complaint that comes in. And, of course, the standards recommend that a prosecutor is the person doing that. There's a lot of reasons for that. The first thing is you have to make sure that these complaints are legally sufficient. And the only person who actually should be doing that and has the power and the authority to dismiss these cases is most often the prosecutor. And that sounds simplistic enough, but there's more to it than that. In our field, again, there are ways that we can stop cases from coming into the juvenile justice system if that's more appropriate. So to give you a local example, we have what we call family crisis intervention. And family crisis intervention is funded by the state, and it is specifically for family-related issues that develop into either not attendance in school, truancy issues, or juvenile justice system involvement. And sometimes those cases have made their way through to a complaint, whether it's my son punched a hole in the wall, my daughter is running away, or these types of things. And those are not cases that we necessarily want to have before a juvenile judge. So what I have done here, and some of the things that the standards talk about, is have a prosecutor review these complaints and petitions, or whatever you call them in your jurisdiction, and be able to screen out those that don't really merit or warrant prosecution, those that might be handled better through diversion programs, which I'm going to speak about, or those that quite honestly need to be dismissed and shouldn't be handled at all as juvenile complaints. So Standard 411-4 talks about that, and we want to make sure, first and foremost, that they are legally sufficient. As a prosecutor, I can tell you that we receive things all the time that I reject as not being legally sufficient, whether they don't have the evidence, whether it's not really, doesn't really rise to the level of juvenile delinquent behavior or that type of thing. We want to make sure that we are doing a good job in getting cases before a court that are obviously legally appropriate. The other thing that we do as part of our screening is make sure that we're getting those best cases in front of the court, and those cases that really merit our involvement in them as prosecutors. The other thing that you can do on this slide is about the assessments. This is such a important thing to have validated screening and assessment instruments, and I have to tell you, as a prosecutor, sometimes that's scary. It's scary to say that I'm going to trust an assessment over my own judgment, or that I'm going to trust whatever it is. Here in New Jersey, we have a risk screening tool, and initially, a lot of prosecutors, oh my gosh, a math equation is going to determine what cases we're handling, and this goes right back to being involved in your community as a juvenile justice stakeholder, because you have to trust in the system at some point, and the only way to trust in the system is to know the system, is to be informed in that system. What is the tool or the assessment considering? How is it being used? Who is completing it? Is that person appropriate to do the assessment? Is the assessment something that we can trust in? And again, that all goes back to knowing what's going on in your community, being familiar with the key players, the people that are involved in it, and being a part of your system, and thereby developing trust. We also, however, want to make sure that we're getting good information. So there's nothing that will come out of these if the juvenile knows or thinks that all of the things that he or she says are going to be used against him if in fact the case ever goes to court or they're unsuccessful in completing the diversion or whatever else is being ordered. And we have to make sure that there are policies in place that support not using this information against the youth that are providing the information in the assessment. Otherwise, the assessment is not, quite honestly, going to be very valid or useful to you as you move through your system. So it's important as part of a screening and an assessment type of role that your prosecutor is involved and that there's trust in the assessments that you're using locally to make sure that it's something that will in fact be relied upon. Diversion is something that, it's a very big word because it means different things all over the place. So when I speak of diversion, we're going to talk about cases that are coming into the court that are being handled outside of the judge, not with a judge. And what's so important about diversion is when we talk about adolescent brain development, not only are we talking about juveniles who may not understand the magnitude, which is oftentimes how I will hear it, but it's also an opportunity to connect with youth, with the positive peers, with positive outcomes. It really is an age of opportunity, as has been quoted and said, and I know Susan speaks of it. It is a great opportunity for us to maybe early on in a youth's life to build upon their strengths, figure out what their weaknesses are, and then enhance those weaknesses. And one of the best things I ever heard of it was a conference that I was at, and the judges were talking, and they had a 16-year-old youth who was on the panel. And one of the things that came up was ordering curfews. And that's not the point of it, other than to say that the juvenile said, I'm going to tell you why I didn't listen to your curfew. I didn't listen to your curfew because at 10 o'clock at night when you wanted me to be home, that's when I was being beaten by my father. That's when all these bad things were happening to me, and I wanted to be anywhere but home. And I have to say, these are the things that we can figure out through diversions if we're doing them appropriately, as opposed to violating for failing to be law-abiding in terms of your curfew. So when we speak of diversion, again, it has to be legally sufficient. We cannot use diversion as a mechanism through which we can apply services. It just doesn't work that way. We here in New Jersey have worked on making sure services are available without, quite honestly, without the court being involved, because if a juvenile and a youth need services, then so be it. But also when we talk about diversion, we're talking about robust diversion programs. So just by way of example, again, speaking of family crisis, when we divert a case to family crisis, I am not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a licensed clinical social worker, but everybody at family crisis is. And they then meet with the families, not me, not the judge, because that's their training. That's what they're experts in. And as I said earlier, of the juveniles that we have sent through our family crisis diversion program, we have seen very little reoffending and very few youth who have not completed successfully that program. So when we talk about whether or not we are successful in this, not only are we protecting our community by diversion, but we are treating whatever it is that was going on in that family, and diversion therefore made the community more safe. And I know that sometimes we don't all think that way, but if you're doing it right, you're actually helping and enhancing the safety of your community. And I have to say, it's a lot of work. Reading these cases, there's a lot of cases. There are a lot of assessments. There are a lot of different times and places for different assessments. But again, it's really important to make sure that prosecutors are doing this. And again, it's mentioned in the standards because I think it's incredibly important that we're the ones doing that. A couple of other things that are really important are victims. We in Ocean County, we have a victim advocate who is assigned to the juvenile unit. I have to say it is so important to have a victim advocate because every victim is also somebody who has now been traumatized. And we need to make sure that we are focusing on the victim, making sure that they are an integral part of the process. Some of the most amazing things that I have seen in terms of the balance and restorative justice are when victims are involved in the process and really are part of the process. There is nothing worse in the world than getting a phone call that the person who victimized or offended has been resolved, and you don't know anything about the case because you haven't been part of it. Victims, believe it or not, want to be part of it. And we also get better outcomes when we bring our victims into the courtroom, it's amazing at times what we see in terms of the interaction. I've had victims and youth hug each other after our court proceedings because of what the youth said on the record, because of what the victim said on the record. And if they're not there, you don't get that connection, and they don't feel that connection to their community. It is really important to keep victims involved in the system, not just because of the fact that they're victims, although that alone is reason, but because it actually helps in your outcomes. It helps in your outcomes in so many different ways, and it really is important. I also want to talk about disposition. You know, of course, the primary factor affecting a juvenile's disposition are the things on the slide, obviously, the seriousness of the crime, the protection of the community from harm. But I also want to go back to it being an age of opportunity. When the assistant prosecutors that I supervise know that I'm going to ask a number of questions about dispositions. Number one, why are you doing what you're doing? If you can't answer to me why you're doing it, then it's not an appropriate disposition. I want you to think about it. I want you to tell me what it is that you're hoping to accomplish. If you just come in and say probation, why? What do we think probation is going to do? Even a diversion, if you're recommending a diversion, why? What is it about that diversion program that you think is going to actually be successful in our outcome? Because at the end of the day, we can talk about community safety, and the only way we're addressing community safety is by making sure that the youth are treated in a way that they do not then recidivate. And that's incredibly important from a disposition standpoint. I also have another rule, and it's reflected in the standards, of course, and that has nothing to do with each other. It's just because I've read the standards, of course, and that is that we need to be active participants in the system. Going back to Luzerne County, there were prosecutors in the room that really weren't speaking about anything that was happening. There were defense attorneys in the room who weren't speaking about what was happening. As a juvenile prosecutor, you need to be up on the record and explaining why it is that we're doing a diversion and stand behind it. If you believe in your diversion programs and you believe in what it is that you've created, then stand behind it. And vice versa. If you're talking about seriousness of the crime, then you need to be there to be an active participant in the proceedings. And that's critically important for prosecutors because, again, we are the ones who are recommending the dispositional alternatives. Now, certainly there's attorneys involved and probation is involved, and there might be some other outside agencies involved. But we need to make sure that we are asking for appropriate dispositional alternatives that will actually help being successful in terms of community safety, youth development, and all of the things that we've talked about through the course of this. I have the perfect video that sums all this up, and we can play that now. The Godfather clip, so we had to go there. But I also want to talk about the offers that you can't refuse. You know, the reality behind this is that in juvenile court, at least here, we have very few trials because we're looking for appropriate dispositions. We're actually looking for dispositions that a youth wouldn't refuse, that a youth and their family understands, agrees with. And listen, that's not always the case. I'm not saying that we don't do that, but we certainly try to resolve our cases in a way that accommodates everything, that takes everything into account, where I could explain why, how, and all of the things that I've addressed before, because this is the most critical part when we're disposing and asking a juvenile to do something. So I'm going to be, I think, Susan, I'm going to turn it over to you to speak a little bit about the human trafficking.
Yes. Thanks, Anthony. And one thing I did want to add, when we're talking about working on these cases and processing these cases, I've noticed that Melissa Sickmund is one of the participants today, and Melissa is truly one of the foremost experts in juvenile justice. She's the executive director of the National Center for Juvenile Justice, and one of the key points that Melissa always makes to me in terms of messaging to juvenile court prosecutors is the importance of data. And that's included in one of our future modules, but I just wanted to take an opportunity here to just impress upon everybody the importance of tracking your cases. We're not going to know if specific dispositions or diversion programs or anything like that is working if we're not tracking these cases. I think sometimes, I know for myself, I would get a little intimidated when I even heard the word data because I'm like, oh, that's a research term. I'm a prosecutor. I don't really understand. Data is basically evidence. We know evidence, and we know that we need to make sure that if something is working, we're going to need to prove that. And how do you prove it? You prove it by your cases. So that's just a little thing I wanted to put in regarding the importance of data. And now we're going to talk just briefly about human trafficking. And this is another part of one of our partners on this project has been Equitas, and we were fortunate to have Jane Anderson, who had done a lot of work on trafficking down in Miami, help us in terms of the curriculum and in also dealing with the policy positions, because prior to this past year, there was nothing in the policy positions really about exploited or trafficked youth. So you will see in the policy positions and guidelines that we now have that information. As many of you know, this is a growing problem in the United States, and this is something that the policy positions, we talk about the importance of truly approaching this from a multidisciplinary approach. The latest numbers from the Department of Justice estimate that there's between 100,000 and 300,000 children between the ages of 12 and 14 who are at risk for sexual exploitation. Most of these are girls. And again, the contact, if they have had contact with the child welfare system, they are at a higher risk. The references for all of this information are included in the policy positions. And in terms of what we're doing, wait, I'm just having a problem here on the slides. Okay, here we go. There, transition, okay. So when we're talking about the exploitation and trafficking issue, I'm not sure how many of your jurisdictions have the safe harbor laws, but those are something that have been passed in many jurisdictions around the country where they recognize that the victims are most often not voluntarily engaged in this conduct, and they've often been forced or coerced. And the basic recommendation of the safe harbor laws is that these cases should be referred to the child protection system, where the law allows us to address the underlying needs of these young people rather than treating them as offenders, because that's really important in the work we're doing with trafficking victims. And now I realize we're getting close to the end, and I'm going to hand it back over to Anthony for the community engagement part here. Anthony? Yeah, thank you, Susan. And I think it's so important that as juvenile prosecutors, we're involved in our community. And that's at all levels. Some of the things that I do, I am the chairperson of our Youth Services Commission. I sit on the New Jersey Council for Juvenile Justice System Improvement. I am on the Racial Disparity Committee. I am on our Ocean County Juvenile Justice System Improvement Commission. And we need to be involved in those things because we need to take an active role in the system. I see some of the points that are coming up in the chat that, these are things that we need to be concerned about. And if we're not in our community, we are not then taking the active role in our crime prevention efforts. We're not actually in our community to the extent that we can trust what is going on. We certainly can't rely on assessments if you can't trust them, and the only way to trust them is to know what they are, to be involved in them, to be involved. And one of the things that we have done in Ocean County is take a really active role in our community. We are appointed prosecutors here in New Jersey. My appointed prosecutor wants us to be, not only do I supervise our juvenile unit, I also supervise our community engagement unit. And we have assistant prosecutors who are specifically assigned to that unit that go out, meet with the community, meet with our faith-based communities, our religious communities, obviously, our every single community that we have, and we become involved. And it has really, it's unbelievable what you can do. One of the things that we talked about at one of our last community meetings was actually we had a police-involved shooting here. And we wanted to talk about that, and we wanted to make sure that the community understood and knew exactly what happened. How was the investigation done? What was the result of the investigation? Because we want to make sure that we are active in our crime prevention efforts. And in juvenile, that's even more so.
I go to a superintendent's meeting every month where I meet with every superintendent of every school district in the county. We speak at every school in the county. We are out all of the time because we want to be involved, and we know that the more involved that we are, the better results that we're going to get from the youth in our community. Again, I am forgetting all of the things that I'm involved with because there are so many of them, because you need to make sure that you're all on the same page as well. Oftentimes I'll go to jurisdictions and there's silos of information here and there's a silo of information here, and those people never communicate and never talk, and then we're out there telling everybody there are no services in our community. When two people are doing the exact complement to each other and not speaking to each other. And as prosecutors, that's our role. That's our job to make sure that we're involved in all of that, that we know of all of that, because we're also the ones in court. You know, we're also the ones that are standing there recommending a diversion, recommending a disposition. And how do you do that effectively if you don't even know what dispositional options you have in the community? How do you do that if you don't know what diversion programs exist? And quite honestly, I think it's impossible. Same thing with truancy prevention efforts. I read something this morning. I thought it was so funny because it was almost like telling me that water was wet. There was an article that going to school helps kids graduate. And I thought, wow, like somebody wrote a paper on that. And I thought, that's incredible, because of course it is. If you are truant, you are more likely to be involved in the juvenile system. You are more likely to be involved in negative peer influence and negative behavior. And of course we should be involved in truancy. Now, that we do not prosecute truants here in New Jersey. They are automatically by statute family crisis petitions, but we need to be involved with our family crisis as we are with everything else. So we do that by many different ways. You saw Richie Sambor. Richie was someone who's known to he's known to our office and volunteered his time to do that for him and to be here. We actually try to attract anybody from Ocean County that wants to be involved in our community engagement, and we've been very successful with that. Susan, I see that there are, I don't think we have time for questions. Oh,
No,
all right, let's go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think we might be out of time. And everybody, one of the things we did discuss this with the NTAC folks is that we knew we had a lot of information to present within an hour, but we have been cataloging the questions that have been coming in, and we can be reaching out and answering those with regard to risk assessments and screenings and restorative justice. So I don't know if we want to finish with Anthony's last video, or if we're out of time. Carissa, you might let us know on that, how we should do this.
Hi, Susan. You guys can go ahead and finish with the last video. That's totally fine.
So the last video, just to let you know, is this was one of our, he's a star, he's on television, he's somebody who's from the county, and he did something for us. It's very short, actually.
Hi, my name's Brian Garrity, and I'm an actor on Chicago PD. Like you, I'm from Ocean County. I grew up in Toms River, graduated Toms River High School East. The Ocean County Prosecutor's Office created a movie called A Note to Parents. Now, this movie is unique because it specifically speaks to parents about the dangers of substance abuse. Parents are a critical part in the fight against substance abuse, yet they sometimes fail to realize it can be their kid too. This movie reminds us that it can and does happen to anyone regardless of where you live or how much money you make. This is a serious problem, and the consequences can be deadly. Talk to your kids about drugs and alcohol. You may be saving their lives.
So that's just an example of one of the guys that we brought in to kind of help deliver our message. We do make movies. We do things like that as well to show in our schools. And Brian has been gracious enough to help us out introducing some of those movies.
Okay. And now, since we're not going to have time for the Q&A, as I said, you have our email addresses and my phone number, and please reach out to us. This is really a critical time in our country, and in terms of what we can be doing on the front lines with youth, we can be turning lives around. It truly is an opportunity, and for all of you who are out there doing this work, we applaud you. We know that it's probably some of the most important work that can be done to help our communities and help our kids, and we really appreciated this time today. I see our question about future webinars. Hopefully we will be able to do our different modules and present some of the highlights of each of the modules to everyone, if that's something we can work out with OJJDP and NTTAC. So thanks, everyone, and I think we go back to Carissa now.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for a great discussion on this topic. We would like to apologize, for not being able to get the questions in, but we saw that there are a lot of good ones really did come in. People were really engaged. This webinar will be archived at OJDP's online university in approximately 3 weeks. And for more information, please contact the National Juvenile Justice Prosecution Center. You may also contact OJJDP or NTTAC via Help Desk by contacting the following information on the slide. And again, thank you all for joining us today, and I'll have a great afternoon.